Everybody in the room has a history with conflict. In your origin, your family of origin growing up, you watched your parents or your siblings either do it or not. Some people think that because they have managed to avoid conflict that they haven't had any, but that's actually your style. You just stay away from it. And whether that's healthy or not, we'll get into in just a second. Hang with us. But I believe the ability to do conflict well will determine how authentic our witness is to a watching world. We've made a comment over the last few weeks as we've gone through this series that divorce is epidemic, and no one plans on divorce. No one gets married hoping one day they'll be divorced. That's absurd, right? But it happens, and it happens about statistically equal amounts in the church and outside the church, which is concerning to me because you'd think people who knew the God of relationship would do it better. But unfortunately, statistics seem to say they don't. And so we want to address that this morning. We believe that God has something better for us.
Yeah.
Now, conflict and intimacy or closeness, proximity of relationship are inseparable, I think. So one way to never have to worry about conflict is just totally stay away from people your whole life. Get a job with the Forest Service, sitting up on a mountain waiting for a forest fire to appear, and just talk to some other person through a radio. Never deal with people. And now, if you can find that job, let me know. I'd like to do that in the summers. But that's not reality, right? It's not reality. Reality is we have to deal with people. So the proximity, the closeness to people, the closer we get, I'm of the opinion, the more likely we are to have conflict because people see us up close, kind of like looking in one of those, those mirrors you ladies have, Guys just glance at a mirror as they go by. But you peer into this magnifying, it just freaks you out of what you see when you're up close, or guys for that matter too. And I think that's what relationship closeness does to us. It points out the obvious things. Robert Louis Stevenson says this: by marrying, you have willfully introduced a witness into your life. You can no longer close the mind's eye upon seemingly uncomely passages. You must stand up straight and put a name on your actions.
I love that quote. That quote is so great. You've willfully introduced a witness into your life. You know what he's saying? He's saying in a much more eloquent way, marriage is a cage match. It is. Marriage is a cage match because, you have these things about your... No, I'm completely serious. Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, I wasn't a big wrestling watcher, but I had an uncle who was nuts about it. Hulkamania was at that time. It was huge. And I'll never forget the first time I saw a cage match. Like, they put a cage around the ring and they locked the door. No one can get out.
And you're not getting out.
I can't wait to see what's going to happen. That's kind of what we do with marriage. We lock the door. We say, no, we're in this. Sick or healthy, rich or poor, no one's leaving this room. And it's kind of do or die. You've offered your life to somebody, and before that door was closed, you could always just leave. There was always this opportunity, like, well, if this doesn't go well, I just move on and I'll find somebody else. But now that the door is closed and it's locked, suddenly all those flaws and all those things that we could just turn our back to before become pretty serious, don't they? Les Perot says this: marriage causes us to submit to the humility of being known in all our phoniness and pride, in all our frailty and blackness of sin. And who cares really to be known that well by another person?
It's no wonder that people say that it takes courage to do marriage well. It takes courage to do relationships well, because we have to confront who we are, not who we would like to appear to be, but who we are. So conflict is, you've heard us say this before, but conflict by definition is just when two ideas run into each other. At the South Campus, we were just getting started, and a young mom had brought her little 2-year-old all the way down, and she sat right in the front, and we weren't like a minute into it, and you could tell he was starting to come unglued, and it took about a minute and a half before the volume level went up so high that she had to take him out of the room. It's amazing to see a little 2-year-old move an adult around. Like, we're leaving. Right? You have an idea that you think you're going to stay and listen to this. Not me. I'm going to make you leave. And so this 2-year-old picks up this adult and makes her carry him out of the room.
There's two opposing ideas, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, we're not hopefully marrying toddlers, but the reality is sometimes emotionally we just say, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to raise the volume and I'm going to have my way.
I'm going to have my way.
This is what's going to happen. And that is a conflict. Now, conflict doesn't have to be terrible, though. When we say, like, who here avoids conflict at all costs, and 70% of the people say that, it's because you only see conflict as bad. But maybe we can redefine conflict as not always having to be bad. Now, strife's another thing. Strife is bad. Strife it's a
cage
fight.
match.
Yeah, it is a cage match. It's the fight. It's the combat. This is about somebody's going to win. Right? And I'm not going to just let our two ideas kind of be on here on the table and they're going to decide which is the best idea and we'll go with that. No, I'm going to win whether I have the best idea or not. You know, even if I'm wrong or not, I'm going in this to win it.
Someone said conflict is like fire. It can burn you horribly or it can illuminate your path. That sounds like a pithy little saying, but it's actually quite true when you think about it, because for some of us in the room, because of the negative things we've witnessed, conflict burned us. It left us emotionally scarred, or maybe even physical abuse or whatever, but it left us with this kind of this bad taste in our mouth. But what if conflict is like a fire that it actually lights our way? It produces some good thing in us. And so we're going to kind of look at that this morning. Proverbs 10:12 says that hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs. Here you have this extreme distinction of hatred is a catalyst for awful kind of negative conflict. But love is like a salve that covers over. Notice it says there isn't the absence of wrong. It just says it covers over the wrong. I think we live in a naive world that think that, well, we'll never have any differences, and we'll never fight, or we'll never have any kind of clash. Proverbs 29:22 says, an angry person stirs up conflict, and a hot-tempered person commits many sins. And so you see here these human emotions of anger and hatred and hot-temperedness. It says, according to Proverbs, it stirs. It's like throwing a dry wood on a burning fire. It just creates what could have been something to warm me now becomes a bonfire that's going to burn my tent down. So, you go into a marriage. I love this quote. J. Grant Howard says, we have the picture of the perfect partner, but we marry an imperfect person. Now we have two options: tear up the picture and accept the person, or tear up the person and keep chasing the picture. That's awesome. The groan was awesome. Just this. Think about what they're saying there. This writer is saying that people can spend incredible amounts of energy chasing something that doesn't exist rather than working towards what they'd like it to be. Mm-hmm. See, this is and this is where we'll see in just a second, one of the areas of conflict is expectations, but this is what we see oftentimes in what we would call maybe the honeymoon stage of a relationship, where you ignored or looked beyond faults just because you wanted to move forward, and all of a sudden, wow, who you really are is not what I imagined it to be, or what I really wanted. Either it's you or it is not what I imagined it or wanted or desired it to be. So I'm going to spend the rest of my days, all my energy, either ripping you up, or we're going to rip up this fantasy. Let's work towards reality here.
Because here's what happens. We have that picture. There we go. Thanks for the illustration. Yeah. We have that picture of a perfect person, and then because of that, obviously, we fall deeply in love with someone, and we marry that someone not knowing that they're imperfect, or knowing it, but not really knowing it. The way an 18-year-old knows that they're going to die someday, but they really don't believe it, right? I'm immortal, that's why they jump on skateboards and bomb down hills and do crazy stuff on ongoing traffic. You're like, you really don't think, you don't understand. I mean, you know it, but you don't know it. And that happens in marriage. We understand, like, oh yeah, we had conflict before we got married. I remember just the other day I was saying, no, I love you more. And she said, no, I love you more. No, I love you more. And he was like, shut up, please. You haven't really done it yet. And so there's this myth that everything good in our relationship is just going to get better. And I hate to say it, but that is a myth, and the sooner that bubble bursts, the better. Because people who have been in long relationships will tell you, actually no, often it gets worse before it gets better. Because it has to get real. And getting real sometimes is painful. You meet the real person, the imperfect person that you married. And meeting the imperfect person is where those two opposing ideas start to collide. And conflict takes place. But conflict, again, doesn't have to be destructive. But there are things that lead to conflict that we need to talk about.
We're going to give you, if you're a note taker, this would be a great one because there's going to be a little bit of material we cover, but we're going to go rather quickly. But conflict creators, number one is unfulfilled expectations. This is where I was talking about where romance collides with reality. That expectations are powerful things. You have an expectation when you get ready to go on vacation, expectations about your day off, expectations about all kinds of things. And that's how we live life. You can't live without expectations. But now when you've got two people involved, you have to understand that there's two players and you're not in 100% control anymore. And so sometimes you find situations, be it the person or the situation, that, wow, this is not going the way I imagined it to go. And that can be really irritating, right? That can be really kind of grating on us, or it can be really disappointing and kind of heartbreaking. But that's life. Things don't go the way we always think they should go.
Next thing we're going to put up there is unexamined lives. And this is just true of all of us. I've said over and over again, I really don't believe we grow up until we have to. And there's different ways to grow up, and one of them is to get married. That's one way that kind of forces you into maybe growing up in adulthood. It should. Military will do that. You'll see a young kid right out of high school who's just like, oh, you're a kid, what are you doing joining the Marines? And they come back and they've been through something and they've been forced to grow to a certain degree. But see, we all have this unexamined lives. It's blind spots, right? We all know what blind spots are when we're driving our car. Hopefully we've all been taught that there's places in the car where panels or something is kind of blinding you, and you don't know if there's someone on the other side of that or not. So you better check really good before you try to get in the other lane. Because what happens, that blind spot makes us have a collision. We try to get over in that lane, and sure enough, there's someone there. Now, we all have this, but the truth is we often don't see them until we get into a marriage relationship. Because oftentimes our friends won't do this for us. They won't point out our blind spots because it doesn't cost them anything.
Or we won't listen to them.
Yeah, our immaturity isn't really a big hang up in their life. Like, oh, that's John. He spends way too much money. He's crazy. You know, he'll blow a paycheck. But what are you going to do? We just love him. Now, John marries Sue, and Sue will tell him.
I don't love that.
Yeah. You've got a blind spot, kid. You need to grow up.
You know, there's only one thing more difficult than trying to deal with a blind spot, and that's dealing with someone who swears they don't have it. Mm-hmm. They argue to the death with you. No, I don't. It's kind of like, say, the blind spot of, just take, for example, selfishness. Like, you know, you're kind of a little selfish. I am not. You're kind of a little prideful. What? I'm the most humble person I know, right? And so they're just like, oh, okay, well, I guess that's the end of that conversation. And that's a dangerous and a difficult thing. And of course, that's rooted in what the Bible calls the blind spot of pride. The third one is unskilled people create conflict. Now, here's the thing. Every marriage has some degree of deficiency because we're not experts. Wouldn't it be great to have 40 years of experience in life and get married for the first time? Maybe it would be great, maybe not. But what I mean is going in with that amount of wisdom, but still have the body of a 20-year-old, all right? So
that I'll sign up for.
Yeah. But the way it works is most of the time, in general, it's a 22-year-old average age that gets married, 23, 24, somewhere in there. And so the simple fact is, at that age, it's not a big character flaw. It's just a fact that you only have so much adult life experience under your belt, like maybe 3 or 4 years. Do you remember how much, what the difference between your senior year of high school and 23? There's a lot of ground in between there, right? Yeah, and so sometimes we enter into a relationship, something complex like marriage. I mean, listen, marriage is not easy. Navigating a relationship with the opposite sex and all that goes along with that, and then you throw children into the mix and jobs and all kinds of things. Listen, there's some stuff we just honestly don't know, and we make mistakes, and so those mistakes produce Heat and noise.
Heat and noise. The next one is unpredictable circumstances. By definition, we don't know they're coming. And it's kind of, again, one of those things like we may believe it could happen, but we don't believe it actually will. Right? That's why we do our best to stand people up in really nice clothes in front of a whole congregation and say, now promise that you're gonna stick together no matter what. If you're sick or if you're healthy, if you're rich or if you're poor, no matter what comes your way. And what we're trying to do is cover all the bases of unpredictable circumstances. But the reality is we don't know when sickness is gonna strike or the job market is gonna tank. And suddenly we're upside down in a mortgage, or we've lost a child, or someone now has a word like cancer hanging over their head. And what we thought we were getting into is something completely different. And time again, we've seen this spin relationships out into two people that were good-willed and loving one another have somehow let this thing get in between them, and they're fighting one another.
Now, those four things on the screen, we're going to give you one more in just a second, but those four things are things that I bet most people, or a lot of people in this room, if you're married, you go, man, that's it. I totally get it. I've been through 1 and 2 or 3 or 4 or all the above, right? And you're here this morning and you've lived to tell about it. You have a testimony that God got you through. I could tell you stories in my own marriage that relate to those four things. A writer named Pamela Brown says this: you can tell a good surviving marriage by the expression in the partner's eyes, like those of sailors who have shared the battles against the foul weather. We hit the storm together and it rocked our world and it inflicted pain and suffering on us, but we got through it and we lived to tell about it, and we're still here. We live to fight another day, and that takes courage and perseverance. But there's one more that I'd like to bring up, because those four on the first four on the screen, those four things, people come to us, and generally people will go into a counseling situation, or they'll pay to have therapy, or they'll take a class, because one of those four things is operating and producing some tension, and they really want to work through it and work on it. There's a level of hope and so forth. But there's one more that I think is a little bit more of an X factor of what produces conflict. Those things generally come at us from the outside. They're circumstances that come from the outside and are brought to bear. This next one, however, doesn't really come from the outside. It comes from the inside, and it's called unwise choices, unhealthy choices, right? And these are things that I do in a relationship that not just only cause conflict, but begin to sort of drill a hole in the bottom of the boat, so to speak. You know what I mean by that? We begin to take apart the relationship with our own hands. We begin to blow it up. Consciously or unconsciously, what we're doing begins to inject a level of unhealth in that relationship.
Just think about that. I mean, if you go through the other four, we can start to deal with our expectations. We can start to examine our lives, discover things about ourselves that we never knew, that our spouse is even helping us discover. We can start to gain the skills that it takes to do life together, how to balance a checkbook, how to save for a future, how to raise children. But after we know all of those things, the truth is the sin in our heart still often chooses to not do them. And there's the unhealth. It's not that I don't know anymore that I have a spending problem, or I don't understand that flirting could really damage my relationship. It's that I don't care, that it fulfills some need in me and I'm not willing to let it go. I want this for me.
A husband or a wife who spend money secretly, don't tell the other until it's discovered. That's an unhealthy choice. I'm going to give you a few examples here so we understand what we're talking about. A spouse who uses sex as a weapon or a reward to get the behavior they want in the marriage.
A husband or a wife that know that their work is interfering with their relationship, but they're not willing to cut back.
A husband or wife who on social media or somewhere else continue to keep an attachment to a past they know they should say goodbye to. But this past relationship has this weird allure. And you know it's not, it'll never be righteously possible but you play with it nonetheless because it excites you. And you create a fantasy world. You create unknowingly a double life that you begin to lead that sooner or later, you mark my words, sooner or later will be exposed. As sure as we're sitting here. It's gonna, and we know it. We no, there's no way I can continue down this road and not be found out. But we just go blind to it. We just go deaf and dumb and blind to it. And we just continue. That's the power of temptation. So James asked the question, the epistle of James, if you haven't read through the New Testament, I encourage you to read the book of James. James is not a gentle book for the faint of heart. James is one of the Lord's disciples who has been given a kind of a hammer.
Yeah.
And he's going to bang us on the front of the head.
It's like a gut punch. Ooh, yeah. James, man, calm down. Out
of the Message version in James chapter 4, he says this. He's asking kind of you don't know? Where do you think all those appalling wars and quarrels come from? Where do you think all this conflict comes from? He's almost like he's playing with us. Do you think they just happen? Think again. They come about because you want your own way and fight for it deep inside yourselves. You lust for what you don't have, and you're willing to murder someone to get it, or you're willing to kill the relationship to get it. You want what isn't yours, and you risk violence to get your hands on it. You wouldn't think of just asking God for it, would you? Why? Because you know you'd be asking for what you have no right to. Like spoiled children, each wanting your own way, you're cheating on God. If all you want is your own way, flirting with this world every chance you get, the fact is you end up enemies of God and his ways. So why do you suppose? Do you suppose that God doesn't care? The proverb has it that he's a fiercely jealous lover. Isn't that interesting that James couches this making of bad choices in a relationship metaphor? James is saying, wait a minute, the reason we're in this mess is because God and I had a thing, and God's jealous for me, and I'm cheating on the God that I say that I follow, and God's reacting to me like a jealous lover would. Don't you think it's common knowledge that God goes against the willful proud, but he gives grace to the humble, to the willing humble?
Think about that. Now, we've gone through a list of things that create conflict, and now we're seeing that James is saying that this actually happens because of sin in our heart. And the reason why we do it bad. Now, no one's ever going to be without unexpected, things that come up in life, or no one's going to marry the perfect person so that there just won't be any conflict. So we know it's going to be there, but there are some things that you can bring into your relationship that are just like grenades. That when I deal with conflict, if I use these, it's going to blow everything up. There's a man, his name is John Gottman. He's been working with marriages for many years, thousands of couples. And he calls these things the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? He kind of wants you to take it seriously. I'd like you to think about that right now. There's these 4 things we want to give you that are so destructive that they're almost like a telltale. If you see these in a relationship, it's nearly dead.
John Gottman, just by the way, is an interesting read if you want to go out on the internet. He's a psychiatrist, works at, I believe he's on staff, University of Washington, and he has surveyed and tens of thousands of married couples over several decades, and he's come up with these patterns that he's watched, and the patterns are so revealing that he can predict with 80 or 90% probability whether a marriage will survive based on the presence of these styles of conflict. One is criticism. Attacking your partner's personality or character. Usually, though, with the intent of someone being right and someone being wrong, winning the argument. Or it's not all bad. I mean, he's not saying that if you do this once or twice. He's saying if these things are chronically present. So this chronic criticism of just not being heard. And sometimes it's a necessary thing because, sometimes it's valid in that, look, I have a need and you're not listening to me, But we know that the volume begins to go up And it kind of leads us to the next one.
Defensiveness. When you're being criticized, when someone's going after your character, not just your behavior, but your character, then the defense goes up. And that's seeing yourself as a victim. Because I'm feeling attacked, I consider myself the victim, I'm going to defend myself, and I'm warding off whatever I'm seeing that is coming from you. But that immediately puts a stop to anything moving forward, to actually getting down to truth.
You know what's interesting is defensiveness is this deflection. We've all been around people. When you bring something up, they never deal with what you're mentioning. They just jump to you. Well, yeah, but if you, or so-and-so. So there's blame. Our culture is like huge on blame and deflection. Well, it's not my fault. If my parents would have, if my father would have, if my boss would have, if my wife would, and everybody's at fault except me. And so what it's avoiding is this personal responsibility for whatever percent I play. Now, my wife could come to me and say, you know what? She criticizes me for something. And I could say, you know what? That's like 90% not true. Wouldn't that be easy to do? And actually be right. End of argument. 90% not true. 90% of what you said is just total baloney. That's just not true. I believe God would have us as people of God and as honest people to go, okay, well, but I'm going to look at the 10. Remember that blind spot? I'm going to look at the 10%. And I'm going to be 100% responsible for that 10% and stop blaming everybody else.
And the next one there is stonewalling. It's very much related to defensiveness, but it's a particular kind of defensiveness that puts yourself behind a wall and just, this is, whatever's happening, it's not going to affect me. I'm behind this. You can't get me. Right? You can't get me. I won't be hurt. And that's almost always what it is. It's a response to some hurt. And the tricky thing is, it might not even been the spouse that hurt them. This could be a hurt that happened long ago, but because of it, a wall has gone up. And so now every time I feel a perceived attack, I'm going to jump behind this wall and you're not going to get to me. But that wall is also going to keep you from intimacy every time. You may put it there, and maybe at one time it actually needed to be there. Maybe you were being hurt or abused or attacked, and you needed to retreat behind a wall because whoever you were with didn't love you, and they weren't on your team, and you needed to hide. But if you bring that wall into marriage, I'm telling you, it will be a wall between you that'll destroy all intimacy.
Well, this is a huge one with younger couples because of our insecurities and because of the baggage we drag into a marriage. Yeah, like the fear of abandonment or the fear of rejection or the fear of failure. So when there's a hint of disagreement, when someone expresses a need and it smells or feels like conflict, we just lay down, we just drop it. Oh, no, I don't want to deal with it. You're right, I'm wrong. We either take the blame or we refuse to deal with the issue. My experience has been as a pastor that maybe solves it for the moment. Whew, we don't have to fight, we're still good, right? But that stuff has an incredibly high rate of resurrection. In other words, when it finally does come out in truth, now it's way more toxic. It's way more difficult because resentment, like a volcano, has begun to build because we both know we never really dealt with this. I've never ever been able to really tell you the truth about how I feel for whatever reason, because I fear your reaction, or I fear how this is going to turn out. I'm insecure about our relationship, and so I'll just stuff it. But it bugs me, it bothers me, but we're just not going to talk about it. Isn't it great that we don't have any conflict, honey? But I'm telling you, when it does come out, it's far more complicated and sometimes more destructive.
This last one, if any of them are more damning than the others, it's got to be this one. This is the one that rides a pale horse. It's death. It's contempt. Right? Just that word, doesn't it just feel painful? When you think of a couple that are supposed to be committed to love one another forever, when contempt enters in, and suddenly, I have nothing but contempt for you.
Contempt is emotional abuse. Contempt is, you make me sick. Contempt is, it's an attack on the inner person of our character. He says that when this one is present in a chronic condition, like continually, the marriage is doomed because we can't live without self-respect. You can't be intimate with someone where you've lost self-respect or respect for the other individual. These things are so key, I believe, to a godly marriage. Now, this is awful so far. I hope they get into something that's a little more positive here. We have to paint this picture because I believe that we have to grapple with the truth of what's really going on here. And by that I mean this whole thing, that number 5 part is somehow rooted in the gospel, you guys. That the ability to do this well is a reflection of the God we say, the all-powerful God we say we believe in. And I believe the world is watching and waiting to see if we have any answers. And I believe we do. I'm confident that we do. But those answers have to be put into practice. Those answers have to be pursued. And I believe that God is not silent on those things. So we're going to give you 5 things to take away. Number 1 is commitment. That may sound kind of childish or like elementary. Oh, right. Of course, commitment. But what I'm talking about is commitment to the relationship. Remember what you said on that day and the frame of mind in which you said it on that wedding day. That frame of mind was positive and full of faith and full of hope and all kinds of things, and you meant what you said. But in a time of testing, you discover weaknesses, you discover wounds, you discover things that bother you, and so the feeling is gone. I think, didn't someone write a song about that? The feeling is gone, baby. It's like, and so all of a sudden, feeling doesn't carry the day anymore. Listen to this. It says in Romans chapter 5, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that when we finally got it all together and worked out a perfect behavior pattern and met each other's needs, that Christ, no. It says, while we were still rebellion, while we were still dysfunctional sinners, while we were still selfish, while we were on the run from God, while we were dragging God's name through the mud, he died for us. He didn't wait for us to get our act together because God's committed to the relationship as the Father was committed to rescuing his Son.
The next one is ownership. In this context, when we say ownership, what we mean is that piece that Bruce alluded to earlier, whatever percentage I can own of what I've done wrong, I need to own it 100%. Right? Maybe I'm only 10% in the wrong in this conflict, but I'm going to own 100% of my 10%. I'm not going to dodge any of it. I'm going to go forward with it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to lead with it. I'm going to lead with, hey, I need to acknowledge that I've hurt you. This is what I've done wrong. Now, when a partner does that, it's amazing how much it diffuses everything. Because suddenly, when you're across the table, the kitchen table, from someone who is no longer operating in pride, but is operating in humility and willing to own it, then you just automatically, this happens over and over again in the spouse's heart. You go, oh, me too. Actually, I've got some stuff I need to talk to you about. And it becomes about restoring now instead of trying to fight for your right and what you've got right. And this is represented in Scripture in Luke 6:41-42. It says, and why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove that speck that's in your eye, when you yourself have a plank in your own eye? Isn't it amazing? Jesus paints the most ridiculous picture. Like, oh,
I love the metaphor.
Right?
I have a 4x4 in my eye, but I notice there's a speck in yours, and I'm going to try to get that out for you because I'm just trying to bless you, brother. It's like, how incredibly ridiculous. And Jesus is almost like being over the top, exaggerating. Like, are you kidding me right now? You're going to consider yourself qualified to get the speck out of your spouse's eye or your leader's eye or your friend's eye. And you've got this, do you see the plank that's in your own eye? And of course we don't. Listen, if you're stuck in a relationship conflict, what I mean by you can't seem to get any traction to move forward, I think you need to go to this one. You need to go to this one and ask yourself, have I really owned my stuff? And am I being honest and willing to embrace it? Because if you don't, the reason you're stuck is because of the scripture in James. No, I want to careful here. I want you to listen. The reason you're stuck is not because I say so or because it's a principle some psychiatrist thought up. Here's why we're stuck. Is because God resists the proud and he gives grace to the humble. And the only thing that fixes a relationship conflict, actually fixes it, is grace. And without grace, we're on our own. We're on our own. So I've got a plank in my eye. I'm going to try to operate on a speck in your eye. I'm on my own. And we don't want to be on our own.
Think about that. You could actually be against God. He could be the one resisting you. The reason why you're not moving forward is because God himself is resisting you. Wouldn't you like to know if that's true or not? The way to find out is by humbling yourself before him. If after humbling yourself, then things start to move, then you could say, I think I've identified the problem. It was my pride.
And some people it's like to think, well, I'll humble myself before God. Like, God, you know what? So you know what I'm saying? So we'll say, I've confessed it to God, but you also offended him or her. Well, that's a little harder. I have to live with you. God here's my point. We're happy to do business with God, but we don't want to do business with other people, but it's the other people we've offended. And that's why we're stuck. And so there's this religious goop that we've got in our lives that just says, I can avoid dealing with you. I'm going to do the Jesus thing, but I'm going to do it without having to really deal with Jesus or you. And it's a deceptive attitude. It's a very dangerous thing. So the third one is hope. Hope is a perspective. And hope is a real thing. Hope has an end. I'm not missing that. But hope is also a kingdom perspective of what's really of value here. So when in life, when I lose a job, I can say, my self-talk will be, you're never going to have another job as long as you live. You're going to live in poverty and be homeless. That's not hope. That's hopelessness. No, hey, God got me the last job. God can get me another job if I'm willing to work, right? That's hope. God's going to take care of me. He's going to provide my needs. But if I don't have that hope in a moment of conflict, I can just cave in. The whole thing can just cave in hopelessness, and we can quit on both each other and on our futures.
And listen, without hope, you're dead. It's like oxygen. You don't live long without it. And there are certain things that just draw all the oxygen, all the hope right out of a room. And they sound like this. They're false agreements. They're unhopeful agreements. They're saying things either in your head or out loud like, I think I've made a huge mistake. I might have married the wrong person. Well, you know what? If you really believe that, if you believe you married the wrong person, then it's over.
You're not going to fight for it.
Yeah, it's done. You've stopped. The hope is gone.
Or you say things like, well, I can never forgive you for what you've done. When you inject the word never in there, you've sucked all the hope right out of the room. You're never going to change. Well, that's hopeful. Yeah. You're never going to change. Talk about a condemning vow. We have to understand something here, that if it's in fact true that what I'm saying and what I believe the Bible paints in Ephesians, that marriage represents the kingdom of God and marriage represents the church, why would we not think that we're going to encounter opposition from an enemy, a real enemy who wants to kill and steal and to destroy? We're in a battle here that's bigger than us, and we have to realize that. But in a moment of conflict, I'm just fired up, and I'm angry, or I'm hurt, or I'm emotional, and all I can see is just you in front of me, and I just want it to feel better right now. And I can say things that are really just really awful confessions. I can make vows that I play right into the hands of an enemy. Many years ago, wasn't here. It was years ago. It was another situation. I had something that, I had a couple who had been married about 6 or 7 years, and they had a little 4-year-old and a little 2-year-old. And this girl, long before social media, this young mom, they'd hit a rough spot in the marriage in a number of ways, and she found comfort in reaching back towards an old high school flame. And she began to dabble in that, and it began to grow and develop. And it finally was exposed, and she found herself in a room with me and her husband and trying to make a decision. And I couldn't get her to stop. I just couldn't. Everything I said, nothing I said seemed to make any difference. And so she had decided that she was going to walk on this marriage and her family and go back to this guy, her soulmate or whatever. And I said to her, your daughter is 5 years old right now, and in 10 years she'll be a young teenage girl. And she's going to look you in the eye and want to know, Mom, why'd you walk out on us? And I'd just like to know before you leave the room, what are you going to say to her? And I will never forget her answer. She said, I don't know. I just need to do this for me. And that didn't turn out well. It didn't turn out well at all. In that moment, we need perspective. What's really being offered here? Temptation is gnarly stuff, man. Temptation temptation doesn't come to us in a moment of strength. Temptation comes to us in a moment of weakness. People who've been through recovery know you have this acronym HALT, H-A-L-T. How do I act? How do I tend to choose when I'm hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? How do I tend to choose when I'm one of those four things? I don't know about you, but when I'm really hungry, I tend to eat junk that I would never eat in any other circumstance. I tend to bring stuff home that I tend to make choices that are not healthy choices. You too? And so the enemy, when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, in a place of conflict, you got to watch your back, because things will come up that you think this is just a divine thing, when it's really not at all. It's actually a setup. That's the time you need to listen to somebody that's older and wiser, and that you're going to tell the truth, and you're going to listen to them, and you're going to say no to your emotions and your feelings, because they're lying to you. Your emotions in that moment are not your friend. They're trying to get you to bite on something that may seem like a comfort in the moment, but it's a false comfort. It's not there to give you life.
Sorry, the next one here is key. Without it, almost nothing else matters. It's grace. You've got to go into conflict choosing to have an ethos of grace. I'm going to bring into this competition of wills, this competition of ideas, a desire to forgive, to cover, to take care of your needs and love you in grace. And I'm telling you, grace is the oil that keeps the engine running. Without it, it's going to seize up. This relationship will not get far.
Forgiveness is grace. Listen to this is in Matthew 6, a familiar passage, but read through the Message. In prayer, there's a connection between what God does and what you do. You can't get forgiveness from God, for instance, without also forgiving others. If you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part. You hear what he's saying? So if we're praying for reconciliation, I'm going to just pray for this thing, but if we haven't forgiven, if there isn't the grace of forgiveness, if there isn't the humility of forgiveness that lets go of that offense and puts it back in God's hands, then according to God, according to Jesus, we're stuck. We're stuck. He can't do his part because we won't do our part. We forgive as we have been forgiven. We forgive as we have been forgiven. And that math is never going to totally add up. We've been forgiven way more than we're being asked to forgive. If we tell the truth, you and I have been forgiven way more than we're being asked to forgive on a horizontal level.
And that's what leads to this next part, because grace is not free. It actually costs something. It just doesn't cost the receiver anything. That's what makes it grace. But it costs the giver greatly. And that's why this last piece is sacrifice. See, the grace you've been given to cover your sins from Jesus Christ, it was free to you, but it wasn't free. It cost the Father his only begotten Son. It cost the Son his health, his life, his freedom. He was nailed on a cross for you. So when we say forgive, we recognize that that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's going to cost you something to forgive your spouse's sins and deficiencies, the sins they've sinned against you, their inadequacies, their unskilled, their unwise choices. Those are all going to land on somebody. And if you want to move in towards them in grace, then it's going to mean great sacrifice. This is where we choose. If I'm going to give you grace, that means I've got to pick up the cross. I've got to. Because see, the cross isn't just a fetish figure or something that you hang around your neck. God isn't just interested in all of us suffering. I just want you guys to carry crosses. I'd really like to see some of you guys suffering. It just does my heart good. No, that's not what the cross is. The cross is where we lay down our lives for one another. We're not just suffering for suffering's sakes. I'm suffering to cover your sin, to love you, to move towards you in forgiveness and grace.
If we can understand, this is where I see couples that have been married for a couple or 3 decades. They've learned the art of sacrifice. You see, if you talk to them about sacrifice, they'll kind of brush it off. Oh, that was nothing. Oh no, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Where you talk to a brand new couple and you go like, you got to sell the sports car. You got to sell the motorcycle. What? I got to sell the motorcycle?
You said I never had to change.
Yeah. What's up with that? You didn't mention that in premarital.
We can fit the baby back there somewhere.
Yeah. The membership, what? I got to give up. My friends, what? You see, when we're immature, when we're uninformed, when we have no vision for the future, sacrifice seems overwhelming and we're not prone to do it. Listen, our culture, look around today, man. Our culture is not, sacrifice is not a big, it's not a big thing. Mm-hmm. It's not like, hey, everybody's out sacrificing. Why don't you jump on that bandwagon? No. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The ethos of our culture is, hey, you can have it your way. Don't let anybody tell you different. You're a world changer. You think we're going to change the world without sacrifice? Mm-hmm. That's a whole nother message.
I want to preach it.
Yeah. Sacrifice is an imitation of the life of Christ. Now, if I have no intention of being a follower of Jesus, I admit that's ludicrous. But if I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to have to imitate. I'm not paying for my sins. What I'm doing is I'm imitating a life that was modeled to me. So as we finish here, we'll put up our questions and the ushers are going to serve us communion. As you survey the landscape of your relationships, what do you see? I want you to really think about these questions, because this is where this comes home to us. As I look over the landscape of my relationships, not just marriage, but my friendships, my family, my siblings, what do I see? Do I see patterns of health? Do I see patterns of sacrifice and grace and honesty and truth-telling that give life to this relationship? Or do I see just these cycles of just death? Do I see just these bad decisions over and over we just can't seem to get over or around?
Next question is this, is how would I describe my attitude in this marriage? Am I more than the 1 mile person? You know what we mean by that? When Jesus was describing to the believers, there's a part that you're just compelled to do. That first mile, by law, they had to carry something for the Roman soldier for a mile. And he said, actually, that means nothing. That goes nowhere towards your righteousness. I want you to then go another mile with them. And are we going into our relationships just doing the thing that's expected of us and no more? I took out the garbage, you do the dishes. And we need agreements about division of labor and how this looks like, but if you're constantly fighting that razor's edge to make sure everything's perfectly fair, that's a pretty miserable contract to be in, to be honest. It's a whole lot better to go ahead and make those agreements, work out all the things you can, and then on top of that, go the other mile for them. Two people doing that is a beautiful thing.
This is where God shows up. It isn't anything that Jesus was talking, if you go back there, thanks, Ray. If you go back there, he's talking about don't resist an evil person. Mm-hmm. So the context of this was that Roman soldiers could force anybody at any moment to make you a young person, hey, you're going to carry my armor for 1 mile or the equivalent. And you didn't have any choice. You had to do that. You were occupied by a foreign power that hated you. They thought you were the scum of the earth, a Jew. I'm not going to cause a Roman teenager. I'm going to cause, you're a Jew, you're going to carry my armor for 1 mile. These are the context that Jesus spoke these words. And Jesus said, that's an evil person. But you know what I want you to do? So a young Jewish boy would know exactly how far 1 mile was, right to the brow of that hill. I know it, that's 1 mile. And he'd get to that point and he'd just drop the armor and say, okay, I'm done. And Jesus says, no, I want you to pick it up and go 1 more mile. And Jesus is talking about doing that for my enemies. What about doing that for the person that I said I loved 30 years ago, 12 years ago, 2 years ago? That's where the miracles show up. But sometimes, if you're like me, I want to see the miracle and then I'll go the extra mile. I want to see the change and then I'm going to give you another mile. But that's not how it works, because it's a life of faith.
I'll go ahead and ask the ushers to start getting communion ready. They're going to be passing it out during the first song here. But while they're getting that ready, we'll just give you this last question. It's this: are there positive things in my relationship that I've been overlooking because of my frustration, anger, or self-pity? It's time sometimes to just stop and rehearse and remember Why am I here? Why am I here? Am I being faithful to that one I love? Or have I lost sight of it somehow because I'm feeling self-pity? I'm feeling taken advantage of, or I'm angry about what's happened.
Yeah, as we pass out, I'd like to just take a couple minutes, and if you're new here this morning, you're welcome to take communion with us. We do it the first of the month. Just hold on to the elements till everyone is served, and then we'll take together here this morning as we finish. But as you take these elements, would you let God speak to you in the minute or so? Just settle down, wherever you're going, it can wait. I believe God's got a word for you this morning.